So we're going to jump right in and start talking about the fourth general principle, which is known as the principle of polarity. And actually, before we do that, I'll give the call-in number. I'm not going to take calls until the second hour. I'm going to stay focused on really getting this information out there. But if there's time in the second hour, I'll take calls toward the second half hour of the second hour of the show. So here's the call-in number for those who want to get in the queue. Call-in number for the show is 866-841-1065. Once again, the call-in number 866-841-1065. Hopefully we'll have some time to get to a few calls, and I am going to ask people to limit the topic of discussion to natural law principles, please. That's what we're talking about here today and have been for the last couple of weeks, and we'll be continuing to talk about this as the first major overall underlying solution to the problems that we're facing as a species. So if you are going to call in, please ask some questions or make some comments about the general principles of natural law or anything else that is related to natural law. So here we go. Principle number 4. And the text that I'm going to be reading some excerpts from is known as the Kybalion. And we talked about this last week and the week before. This is a general Hermetic text that talks about the principles that underlie everything. That's basically what this text is all about. It's very simple. It's not very long. It's probably about 50 pages in digital format, something to that effect. And if you own it in a hardback copy, maybe about 100 pages. So this is not anything that's an extremely long or drawn out discussion. It's there to act as a primer for those who want to begin to grasp the principles that are always at work. These are general principles that underlie natural law that are always at work, whether we believe in them, whether we understand them, whether we accept them, whether we want them to be in place or not. They are in place. They are inherent to creation. So we are bound by these laws, whether we like them or not. That's completely irrelevant. I'm attempting to explain how these laws function and operate so that if we want to get out of the levels of self-inflicted suffering that we are in as a species, we can do this by bringing our actions into harmony with these principles. If we decide to not do that, we're going to continue to suffer and things are going to continue to become extraordinarily chaotic here on planet Earth. And in coming weeks, I'll be getting into how the expressions of natural law function. And essentially what that part of this discussion is all about is really delving deeply into the principle of polarity as it is connected with the principle of cause and effect. These are probably the two, overarchingly, the two most powerful and critical to understand in the seven, okay? And if we don't understand how the basic polarities function and how us choosing them and embodying them ultimately gets us the result that we want through the law of cause and effect, we generally understand nothing. All right? So the understanding the expressions of natural law really goes a long way to helping us understand how these two principles work in conjunction with each other. And it's very interesting to note that there's a lot of people who are interested particularly in the principle of polarity. An interesting side note is that the #1 search term that gets people to my website at whatonearthishappening.com, you know, the traffic to my site, if you look at some of the analytics about it, aren't generated by people linking to the site. They're generated by people searching for certain concepts and ideas that are contained in the material that's on the site and then finding it that way. And the #1 search term that drives people to the What on Earth is Happening website is polarity. I was as surprised as anyone else to learn this. But it shows you that people have an idea that these principles and laws actually do govern what's really going on here. and understanding them is the utmost thing that we can do towards bringing about a resolution, a solution to the problems that we're facing. So let's jump into principle number 4, and the readings, when I read quotes, are from the Hermetic text known as the Kybalion, which is actually posted to my website. I believe it's under podcast number 73. You can find a PDF copy of the Kybalion. So, principle number 4, the principle of polarity. Quote, everything is dual. Everything has poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half-truths. All paradoxes may be reconciled. The Kybalion. Now I'm quoting from the Kybalion once again, and this is the initiates who wrote this book, this is their assessment of this general principle. This principle embodies the truth that, quote, everything is dual. Everything has two poles. Everything has its pair of opposites, all of which were old Hermetic axioms. It explains the old paradoxes that have perplexed so many, which have been stated as follows. Quote, thesis and antithesis are identical in nature, but different in degree. Opposites are the same, differing only in degree. The pairs of opposites may be reconciled. Extremes meet. Everything is and isn't at the same time. All truths are but half-truths. Every truth is half false. There are two sides to everything, etc., etc., etc. It explains that in everything there are two poles or opposite aspects, and that, quote, opposites are really only the two extremes of the same thing with many varying degrees between them. To illustrate, heat and cold, although, quote, opposites, are really the same thing. The differences consisting merely of degrees of the same thing. Look at your thermometer and see if you can discover where heat terminates and cold begins. There is no such thing as absolute heat or absolute cold. The two terms heat and cold simply indicate varying degrees of the same thing, about the general principles of natural law. And we were reading from the Kybalion on the principle of polarity. I'm going to pick up the reading. They were talking about the fact that opposites are really only two extremes of the same thing, and they have varying degrees in between them. And we left off talking about, they were giving an example of temperature, heat and cold. So it said, look at the thermometer and see if you can discover where heat terminates and cold begins. There is no such thing as, quote, absolute heat or, quote, absolute cold. The two terms heat and cold simply indicate varying degrees of the same thing, and that same thing, which manifests as heat and cold, is merely a form, variety, and rate of vibration. So heat and cold are simply the two poles of that which we call heat, and the phenomena attendant thereupon are manifestations of the principle of polarity. The same principle manifests itself in the case of light and darkness, which are the same thing, the difference consisting of varying degrees between the two poles of the phenomena. Where does darkness leave off and light begin? What is the difference between large and small, between hard and soft, between black and white, between sharp and dull, between noise and quiet, between high and low, between positive and negative? The principle of polarity explains these paradoxes, and no other principle can supersede it. The same principle operates on the mental plane. Let us take a radical and extreme example, that of love and hate, two mental states apparently totally different, and yet there are degrees of hate and degrees of love. And a middle point in which we use the terms like or dislike, which shade into each other so gradually that sometimes we are at a loss to know whether we like or dislike or neither. And all are simply degrees of the same thing, as you will see if you will but think a moment. And more than this, and considered of more importance by the Hermeticists, it is possible to change the vibrations of hate to the vibrations of love in one's own mind and in the minds of others. Many of you who read these lines have had personal experiences in the involuntary, rapid transition from love to hate, and the reverse, in your own case and that of others. And you will therefore realize the possibility of this being accomplished by the use of will, by means of the Hermetic formulas. Good and evil are but the poles of the same thing, and the Hermeticist understands the art of transmuting evil into good by means of an application of the principle of polarity. In short, the act of polarization becomes a phase of mental alchemy known and practiced by the ancient and modern Hermetic masters. An understanding of the principle will enable one to change his own polarity as well as that of others, if he will devote the time and study necessary to master the art. So that is the principle of polarity. And what I would add to this, my comment would be, is that there is most certainly only one thing and degrees of it. We can take light and darkness as an example, as they did here. And there's really no such thing as the dark. There is only light, or its absence. It's the removal of the presence of light from a particular place is all that darkness is. Light is still all that exists. There is no actual such thing as darkness. It is an illusion based on the non-presence of light energy in a particular space. So the illusory quality is what I would add, is that we only see polarities in place, but really there's only one thing. Love and fear, I've talked about as the two basic polarities. But really there is only love. There is only consciousness and its expansion. In an illusory state of mind, there is the presence of fear. This is an illusion that needs to be recognized as such. And that's a tall order. Saying that and doing that are two extremely different things. Talk about extremes. Saying and doing can be looked at as two opposite polarities, extremes. Because it's really easy to say that fear is an illusion, but actually removing it from your life such that you do not live in fear can be a tall order, especially in a world like this, that people who have bought into this illusory identification, the world that they've made as a result of it can certainly make that a tall order. But we need to understand, really, there is only the absolute or the one thing, and then there's just degrees from it that extend down from it. Okay? Knowledge and ignorance we can look at as another polarity. Well, total knowledge is the mind of God, which of course we aspire to. We're probably not going to achieve that in human form, all right? But, so we're all at different degrees of ignorance. Extreme ignorance, the total refusal of truth, and the total willingness to even acknowledge that there is any such thing as natural law principles that are in effect, the total refusal to acknowledge that there is any such thing as the underlying basis of matter being vibratory energy and these differing degrees that we call polarities. This is extreme ignorance, okay? It's just a degree of it. But really, there is only supreme knowledge. That's all there really is. Everything else is just a veil over top of that. And that's put there through different layers of fear, different expressions of fear. We're going to look at those expressions on a future show. Because if we understand how the two ultimate polarities, love and fear, work, and how one is basically an illusion, and what we create by choosing one or the other of those two polarities, even though one is illusory, it goes a long way toward helping us understand why we have created that which we have created here collectively. Again, not as an individual. This is a completely erroneous view of the law of attraction. One individual does not make the collective reality. We all make it together. That's why it's a shared experience of what this world is. Just one person changing their thoughts isn't going to get the entire external manifested reality to change. If anybody thinks that's how the law of attraction works, the law of cause and effect works, you're delusional. Enough minds need to be changed. This is why it's called a quantum effect. Quanta, after the Latin word meaning amount. Quantum means amount in Latin, or a degree. Okay, so they're talking about transmuting evil into good by means of the application of the principle of polarity. We can only do that once we truly deeply understand how this works. We're going to look at that when we look at the expressions of natural law. And I've put that chart of the expressions up on the site week after week, even though have not directly been talking about it for a reason. I want people to continue to look at that, to understand this is ultimately how it works. And it's a one-way street, folks. You can only ever create good or order by using the true polarity, which is love, which is higher consciousness, the expansive force of consciousness. The last few weeks here, and we just took a look at the principle of polarity. Believe it or not, the #1 search term that drives people to the What on Earth is Happening website is polarity. And it shows that there are people who are looking for answers, who do understand that we live in a seemingly dualistic realm. It's dualistic at the level of manifestation. But when you understand that behind all of that, the dualism is illusory. And it's illusory because people are falling away from an understanding and a deep introspection of the true self and into different states of fear-based consciousness. This is what all of the flagrant violations of natural law that we see around us are underlined by. Underlying all of it, at whatever level these violations of natural law are happening, there is fear. Always you'll hear the person who is breaking that natural law principle giving a justification, saying, but what if, but this, but that, and making projections into the future about what could happen if this were to be continuing to be allowed to occur. It's all fear-based. All fear. The same thing for people who are okay with the kind of police state that we're moving into, who think that this is for their protection or their safety. All fear-based consciousness, because you have to be thinking about protection from what? What do you imagine? The things that the imagination can bring up that can happen to you. And in that dwelling, that mind state of dwelling in fear, that's how you give up your true self and ultimately how you give up your freedom. Which is why I continue to emphasize ultimately fear has to be overcome. Otherwise, we can't create a better future. It's not possible. And that has to be done on a one-to-one basis. That's an internal struggle. That's internal warfare, if you will. Because that battle takes place within the heart of each individual. the heart and mind. Someone can show someone through example how to live good mental practices, good emotional states, a thirst for knowledge, but ultimately they can't make them be like that. Someone has to make that decision to be in the world like that on their own. So there's a one-to-one battle that takes place with fear within the hearts and minds of each individual. And that's where that battle is won or lost. So I think this is the same caller who I accidentally disconnected.